Hi there, I'm Marius, and in the last videos we already talked about server logic and how to implement this, but the samples were very artificial and like really testing out what you can do. And in this video, we will put this more into an embedded scenario with training events. And this means we will focus less on how the technical calling of those server logics and custom APIs works, but more on how everything works together and how this will help us with the security challenge that is introduced by our data model with certain types of training events. As a scenario, we are offering here training events to selected customers through our Power Page, which acts as a portal. And there are two types of training events. Public training events, which are just open for everyone, but there are also private ones. You see here a private one, and those have invitations. And in this case, test 3 is an account which is invited, and in the other case, here we have specific contacts being invited to this event. And then, of course, there are registrations, but registrations are never on an account, but always on a contact within the invited account or the directly invited customer, or in case of our public event, just anyone. These two types of events pose a challenge for the security. You can, for example, set up table permissions so that they can read all training events, or you could do it via the training event invitations, where you go directly, okay, it is connected to the contact via an invitation, or it is connected to the account of the contact via an invitation. This all works, but if you want to also see the public ones, there is no connection, therefore you would need to assign global access. And assigning global access can be a major problem in terms of security if, for example, the name of an event or some other information here leaks information, like a name of another customer you have. And if you have assigned global access and enabled the web API for the training event entity, well, then everyone can read all the training events and therefore get from a name what other customers are. Such a setup can, by the way, also be a problem for regular Dataverse when you want to keep private events, for example, within the business unit of the owner, but public events should be visible to everyone. But in Dataverse itself, you can trick around that by, for example, assigning the public training event to a team where everyone is a member of, or you share it with this team, and thus the private events stay with the original owning business unit, and the public ones have either a different owner or an additional sharing. So now how do we get around this problem in Power Pages? So you see right here in table permissions, I have not given permissions to the training events. I only gave permissions to contact, and I will explain to you later why. And now one solution would be to use Liquid with its feature to perform fetch XML queries to then only retrieve the data that we think the user should see. Of course, here is the risk that the developer does a mistake, shows too much data, but that is a risk we will have to take here because the built-in security won't catch this correctly. However, Liquid is a thing mixing front-end and back-end functionality because it performs on the server but influences the rendering of the page. Performing queries makes the site slower in loading the initial page, and therefore often people prefer to use something like an API. But as said, if we want to use an API, we would have to give global access here to this table, and we don't want that. Instead, what we will use is the server logic feature. I've created here two server logics, one for get training events and the other for register for training event. And both are enabled for authenticated users. And then still, if you want to query Dataverse data in a server logic, you need the appropriate permissions to that data for the query, because the security concept is integrated into that feature as well, but I didn't give them. Instead, what I've created here are two custom APIs in Dataverse, and we will take a look at them just in a few moments. If we look into the custom APIs, They are both bound to the entity contact, and this will help me with my security later on. So here we have the implementation of the Get Training Events plugin, which is behind that, and this takes the target contact and then queries events which the contact is registered to already, public events, and then we have contact events, which is events where they are invited directly as a contact here with the customer, or we have the account events, so when the customer's parent customer ID record is invited. And then we will output here these 4 entity collections. These are defined as custom API response properties of type entity collection and will be returned to the client. The other custom API register for training event is a bit more debatable because this does not have the security problem. In terms of training registrations, you only need to read and write registrations which the contact is directly connected to. So therefore the security setup would be quite clear. I still did here as a custom API, as I would like to check, for example, for private event, if there is really an invitation either on the contact or the account. And I only want to apply this logic here when it comes from the Power Page and not when it comes from my model-driven app in Dataverse. So that allows the back office members a bit more freedom when they just want to register someone by hand for an event. In this case, we have 2 input parameters. One is the registration, which we will just create, and the other is the bound entity contact. And then down here, before we create the registration, the contact property is always overridden with the contact where the bound action is executed. So this property MWO contact cannot be manipulated by a user in our Power Page. So with that, let's get over into the Power Page. We will start at the server logic. If I'm a little bit too quick with these, just take a look at my other videos for bound and unbound custom APIs. This one is a bound one, so we are looking at the contact. Then we are taking the server.user.contactID property, and this one is not manipulatable by the user because this is a server object, so they would somehow need to be able to fake the whole authorization to the server if they wanted to impersonate another user with reading their training events. And then you have this prefix and then the name of our custom API on contact. And finally, the response, we just parse out the body of the response. I've taken a bit more verbose implementation here where I check the response and catch errors and wrap them to avoid that I give out too much information to the user. Something like stack traces and so on might reveal something that I don't want to. For get training events, of course, the get function, because it's a reading operation, is implemented. However, in invoke custom API, still post is used because my custom API is not marked as a function, as I wanted to keep myself the option open to maybe pass additional filters to the logic in the future. And I promised I would reveal why I gave the read and update privileges on contacts earlier in table permissions. This is because you can't execute a bound custom API on an entity which you do not have the right privilege on. And because the contact ID here will always be a self access because it's the current user, the self privileges are totally enough to achieve this. For register for training event, of course, it's a post because we are creating a registration here. And again, we are binding the contact ID here from the server object, and then the body is passed as is. If the user tampers with the body here and passes some invalid properties, of course, the server logic will fail either directly before the call because the Microsoft layer does not recognize the input as an entity or inside the logic when it really tries to create the record. And then finally we come to the home page. So you see here we have just some diffs to show our output. In the end, it will be shown in the events container. The events loading and the events error are shown and hidden dynamically. Then I've not implemented into the custom.js file here because that really makes debugging hard. Instead, I've linked here a /training events.js, which is a separate web file. You see the training events.js here. I've totally implemented this one with AI, so I won't go too much into details. Just you see here the endpoints and the server logic, right? And we render the results as cards and then tag them based on which return property they were in. If you need more information on how to call server logic from Power Pages client, then again, I would refer you to my other videos on this topic, which I will link in the description below. And finally, so you see in the designer, you will only see the loading spinner here. Let's preview this. And of course, first we get an error because we are not allowed to use this server logic because we are not logged in yet. Let me fix that. So now that we have logged in, so you see here the request is pending. And now it has completed. Microsoft wraps this themselves always into an object with a success parameter, for example, the server logic name. And then here the data parameter is what we return from our get function. And if we take a look here at the events, yes, we see all 3 events. The one we were invited personally to, the one for our account, so invited by company, and then the public one. Let's register for an event. And you see right here, register for training event has a 200, and we have success true, and it actually returns here the entity that was created, including the ID, should that be needed somehow. So let's select this event in Dataverse. And down here, you see my registration for the training event with the contact Marius person. And that works even though the registration we initially provided to the custom API did not include any link to the contact. It only included a link to the training event. And as discussed previously, because this was a private event, the linking to the event only worked and did not result in any of this invalid plugin execution exceptions is because there was a personal invite for that specific contact in the system. And that's the invite right here. So the style of working with custom APIs to bring functionality to Power Pages required very minimal privileges for the user in Power Pages because we are working in our custom plugin, and that has totally different privileges, and it really allows us to give a narrowed down experience. However, you also have then to manage this code. And also for all the changes you are planning to make, you are losing a bit of flexibility, right? Because you need to adapt the queries in the backend, deploy them. And if that change in the backend logic somehow changed the interface a little bit because response properties behave a little bit differently, or if you added a response property and removed some other, that will mean that you will have to coordinate the front end change in Power Pages accordingly, and all this has to happen at the same time. So we introduce some other challenges while we tackle the security challenge here. This is all okay, we can manage this. I just want to think ahead, right, and not to blindly apply this everywhere, because it really means you are just creating code that you need to manage. And in this particular case, we might have been able to mitigate the whole issue ahead of time by just creating a slightly different data model where we did not have the types but just two different tables for public and private training events, but that might cause some other issues down the line. So you really have to deeply think about for what you are optimizing here, what will give you the least amount of technical depth in these scenarios. With that, I will end this video now. See you in the next one.